My name's Giulio, Sica. I've been coming to Breaking Convention since it started in 2011. In 2004, I attended also a psychedelic conference, exploring consciousness, which was, I think, was the first national psychedelic conference which started to introduce the science and the medical approaches to efficacy of psychedelics, which had been underground since the Misuse of Drugs Act in 1971. It was the first track of seeing medicalization as a route out of prohibition. And I think a lot of counterculturalists or anti-prohibitionists were feeling confident in that aim. And I think a lot of people have been feeling, and there's obviously at a conference like this where there's so many different approaches to psychedelics, that there is an increasing emphasis on the medicalization and the scientific research on psychedelics, which is starting to dovetail quite disturbingly with the corporate sector and what I will go on to describe as the end product of neoliberalism and the kind of extractive capitalism which has existed, well, in increased form over the past 40 years, and the kind of culture discussions or arguments that seem to be arising in the general public over many issues around value and around morality and ethics, and how that manifests, and how perhaps we can bring back the balance to the more folk experiences of psychedelics, whether it's counterculture through rave, and obviously, which is again a big political discussion, the indigenous practices which have existed for centuries and which now seem to be the big discussion around what is cultural appropriation and what is being taken out of those communities, and how science seems to be, or certain scientists within a system seem to be facilitating that. So I don't know how to approach this, but it just came to me to write this down. It's kind of like a potted history of various substances I've taken over the years, and it's nothing to write home about, actually, because there's many people here who've had, and just generally in the psychedelic space, who've had many experiences, whether it's through rave culture. For me, I was 23 when I was really, the first time I properly smoked and got properly deeply stoned. I was in Italy. But the seminal experiences, I guess, which coincided, many friends of mine were taking ecstasy in 87, 88, and I was reticent. I was not quite ready. I was studying at the time, and the moment in 91, it was as close to a spiritual experience for me. It was a moment of kind of, I'm going to say it's going to sound cliched, but it was understanding that the universe was made of love. That's basically it. It was like anything even negative, and it was an imminent experience. I felt it in the body. I was with a friend. I was able to discuss this. And of course, you come down and you try and reinsert that into society, and it's a little bit harder because you're talking about subjects, spirituality, culture, which are not as easy to embed in a society which is already frowning upon. Obviously, we'd had the 60s, the hippie, the counterculture, and the I was born in 1967. I saw a documentary that said in the spring of 67 was kind of when the Beatles released All You Need Is Love. There was a big psychedelic wave happening in London. Buildings in West London and Chelsea were being painted. What's the road in Chelsea? The King's Road was all painted in psychedelic colours, but by the autumn of 67, via the newspapers, etc., all the kind of scandal, it was kind of ridiculed as this just hippie nonsense that we had to get back down to, kind of brass tacks and what's really going on here. The misuse of drugs happened in 1971. There was also a period there of political uprisings, anti-Vietnam protests, civil rights protests, and some quite militant actions from the counterculture, which really wanted to challenge a society which had become already over corporatized, medicalized, and the military-industrial complex was pervading all manner of the economy. There's so much to cram in, and I hope I can get some of it. But the Nixon shock in 71. released a period of inflation, and everything kind of dulled down through the 70s. And it was the late 80s where rave came back in, and it was the discovery of ecstasy, and that created a whole subculture. Now, that happened. The clubs have been going on for 30 years, 35 years. That's rave culture. But I read this book by a professor of political and cultural studies, Jeremy Gilbert, who's a professor of political and cultural studies at East London University. He writes on left-wing politics, socialist politics. He writes about neoliberalism, how this system of financial extractive capitalism colonizes spaces, physical spaces, obviously indigenous lands, but also our mental space, how it gets us to consent to behaviors that we would not normally want to consent to, which are not in the interests of the majority. And it does this through a process of culture, what we deem acceptable and unacceptable. So this quote, which I feel, I mean, he talks also about how big tech and Wall Street coincided in the 90s, in the mid 90s, and how they kind of bolstered each other. So tech was used in the stock exchange, but it also increasingly from California married in with Wall Street's system of ever liberalizing capitalism, which became also extractive, and we kind of we're living in that techno capitalist world at the moment. And the way that that's embedded in us, he puts in this quote, which is, hegemony is best understood as a form of leadership where particular groups acquire the ability to determine the general direction of travel of a given social formation. Now, my contention here is that is what's happening with the science track. I absolutely think that the science is important. Of course it is. The medicalization understanding, not the medicalization, but the medical approach is obviously fits in with the society we're already living in. But there is a way that all other discussions, even though this discussions exist here, on the cultural, shamanic aspects, spiritual aspects, kind of get put to one side, and this is the proper way of discussing psychedelics. It's that the scientific way is the acceptable way. You're right. Awesome. So there was a book launch earlier this at the start of the conference. This is Alan Piper, who's a psychedelic historian. And he talks about, obviously, Bicycle Days, the day that Albert Hoffman intentionally took a dose of LSD, which he discovered through his research in with the ergot fungus. And obviously, that eventually led on to the countercultural 60s. But Alan Piper goes further back, and he recounts stories of psychedelic use in the 19th century in Victorian England, and use of mescaline and also alcohol, absinthe, and there was a big emphasis on what he calls transgressive behaviors, deliberately going against what was then seen as the over mechanization, industrialization of Britain. So there was a whole movement, the Romantics, but also an art movement, the Modernists, who were, ironically, as Alan says, against a kind of modernity which was taking the life and soul out of culture, and there was a kind of deliberate transgressiveness which challenged that. And I feel that there is a parallel with what happened in the 60s. I mean, Alan mentions that there's a parallel. He says psychedelics became a technology of resistance in service of the pre-existing oppositional consciousness, which is the counterculture of modernism, which in the 60s became kind of hippie counterculture, and within countercultural circles of the 60s, and the touchstone of austerity. So medicalization is very much about making the experience of psychedelics as safe and predictable as possible. That is understandable. That is what is expected within the medical establishment. But any deviation from that, and the criticism is coming from the left as well as the right. Symposia do wonderful work in exposing various difficult behaviors, abuse within psychedelic spaces, etc. Also, kind of feel that the claims of safety that are being presented by certain scientists at certain points in this whole psychedelic renaissance are actually a bit overstated, that there's always going to be a wild element to psychedelics and to experiences, and that we would do well to acknowledge that they are not going to be easy and predictable, and that we should allow ourselves to have these conversations without feeling demonized and separated in however subtle ways that happens in culture. So part of the reading that I was doing while I was studying at Bath Spa environmental humanities, and there's a whole section of environmental humanities called ecofeminism, which is really looking at how this split between it sounds obvious, the masculine and the feminine, but between the overly rational approach to looking at reality and the more intuitive approach, or which we would say the feminine approach has been come to be known as, kind of started in the 16th, 17th century after the Reformation, when over a process of 200 to 300 years, the ruling class of the time was introducing laws called the Enclosures Act, which was claiming public land, which had always existed as common land, and which many women within small communities were growing their own food and administering to their own affairs. And one of the devices that was used, insists Silvia Federici, who's a Marxist historian looking at this, is the idea of witchcraft, of transgressive behavior being a threat to the order. At the time, it was the post-Reformation Christian order, and which is the fear that there was something demonic in the practices of what women were doing, the folk wisdom, is a device that has come to continue, I feel, very much. Again, very important, the discussions around conspiratoriality and the grooming from right-wing groups that can insert themselves into movements such as the wellness movement and spirituality and psychedelics. But there's also the fear that any kind of spirituality, any kind of aberrant behavior is seen as it needs to be demonized or excised. Obviously, in the 15th, 16th, 17th century, that was witch burning, but there is another form of kind of ostracization, which can be in its own way really, really destructive of communities. And so I'll read the quote out. It's from her book, Witches, Witch Hunting and Women. Witch hunting in all its different forms is also a powerful means to destroy communal relations, injecting the suspicion that underneath the neighbor, the friend, the lover, hides another person lusting for power, sex, wealth, or simply wanting to commit evil deeds. In the worst aspects of these, I mean, here we're in a privileged bubble, this amazing conference, you know, with these amazing speakers from so many different approaches. And for me, it's always been about the discussions that happen outside and the differences of opinion. And if we can be civil in how and we can sometimes, and sometimes we're not civil, sometimes we have arguments. And if we can find ways, the whole point of, for me, of all my experiences, as I said, it's very much like it was part of the culture. It's not like I went off and joined a commune. I was in the city. I was in London. I grew up in London during that whole explosion of rave culture. It was in every pub that you went to. It was around everywhere. And it's the conversations. Hey, man, you know, like calm it down. If someone's, these are things that emerge from the ground up. And for me, it's always been a point of resistance that the idea that a doctor is only going to come along and say, hey, what we need with MDMA is you know, like a kind of room with soft furnishings and, you know, put eye patches on. And that's a way, it's a way to approach it. But the chill out rooms that emerged from raves happened organically. No one sat around in a committee and kind of, you know, decided to have a peer-reviewed study to see if a chill space would be the right space. It emerged, the right music emerged at the time. It's this a communal effort. And it's very much, I mean, I listened to Georgia Gaia's talk on techno culture, just temporary autonomous zones. And there was a deep political culture in the 80s, 90s, which then quelled, and the science has come in, and those cultures still exist. I see them, and I know there are people who are embedded in those cultures as well, but it's not so much talked about in the mainstream. So I don't know how I'm doing for time. Okay, so that's my contention. I'm going to use, there's a quote, again, I'm going to read out. Scientism This is not anti-science. This is science in its own field. What it covers, understanding the material world, is, it is the gold standard of itself. It does what it does brilliantly, and it's undeniable. The issue is in a philosophy which itself can't be falsified, because the whole point of science is something has to be falsified or verified to be seen as true. If it can't be falsified or verified, it doesn't exist. Not only does it not exist, it's actually, again, back to the witch burning, seen as kind of like, abnormal behavior, mental disturbance. Scientism is that belief that science will explain every facet of human experience at some point in the future, if we just believe in it. Now, this Austin Hughes wrote a book, The Folly of Scientism. He's a scientist himself. The temptation to overreach seems increasingly indulged today in discussions about science, both in the work of professional philosophers and in popular writings by natural scientists. It is frequently claimed that natural science does or soon will constitute the entire domain of truth. And this attitude is becoming more widespread among scientists themselves. All too many of my contemporaries in science have accepted without question the hype that suggests that an advanced degree in some area of natural science confers the ability to pontificate wisely on any and all subjects. I mean, he got his own criticism, obviously, of that from scientists who had their backup about that. And again, perhaps it's provocative, but it is that thing of what I've noticed happen as more and more of the scientists are being interviewed in the media about psychedelics, that they're starting to broach into speaking about politics, which they don't necessarily know what they're talking about in politics. I'm not saying that I'm an expert, but Jeremy Gilbert, as a cultural theorist, is, and he's as concerned as I am by figures such as Robert Mercer, who was a Trump supporter, Peter Thiel, again, the founder of PayPal. But this what is really can be described as a white tech bro culture that originates in California, which is studied, kind of sees Ayn Rand, the kind of pseudo philosopher, as some kind of real bastion of truth. Some people would argue, and we get into the whole Jordan Peterson, again, I didn't want to name it, but it is in the cultural air. Robin Carhart Harris, brilliant, innovative scientist who has done so much of the recent work on, kind of brain scans on various psychedelic substances, interviewed Jordan Peterson recently, or was on his podcast. And, he has every right to do what he wants to do with that, but there should be at least some kind of school of recognizing that, look, there is a cultural implication to that. And it's this whole thing of who's on the right, who's on the left, who's individual, who's collectivist. And the reason I worry about it so much is that's again my belief. It's many figures on the left and counterculturalists have said this before. Corporate capitalism is extractive. It can't help but seek out the best profit, and really to hell with anything else. To hell with land rights, nature rights. To hell with your personal beliefs. It's going to mow all that down, and it's got its claws into psychedelics. Maybe it always has had some kind of, moment to be involved. We can talk about the historical connections to MK Ultra and all the kind of government plan, etc. But really, we're talking about a system of economic extractive capitalism, which is seeing psychedelics as the possibility to sell the new medicine of the future and to not really change anything in the system, which hopefully some of you can feel is not exactly going in the right direction. So I love just this quote from Albert Hoffman: by observing natural scientific discoveries through a perception deepened by meditation, we can develop a new awareness of reality. This awareness could become the bedrock of a spirituality that is not based on the dogmas of a given religion, but on insights into a higher and deeper meaning. I'm referring to the ability to recognize, to read, and to understand the first-hand revelations. I think scientists have to do their job, and I absolutely need to. I think it's important that indigenous communities preserve their way of experiencing the mystical. But also there's a whole bit in between, which I feel is what I feel part of in some really loose way, whatever that post-rave culture is, of having mystical and spiritual experiences and even community experiences and connecting to nature. connecting to a recognition that what we experience in these states often is something that's alive and communicating with us on some level, not necessarily verbal, and that we can create some kind of response to climate breakdown, to extractive capitalism that is more in tune with more indigenous knowledge, but also folk knowledge and indigenous knowledge from Europe, which was lost in the first wave of colonization that the Romans, managed 2,000 years ago. So where are we? 5 minutes? Okay, okay. Well, that's good then. And finally, I say this is the thing: is that in saying all of that, I'm steeped in that same capitalist realism. I'm wearing products. Got an Apple computer. I drive a car. I'm steeped in it as well. Recognizing that you're part of it. It's often used, for example, against Extinction Rebellion and climate protests. Well, they drove there with a car. How can they be, virtue signalers, etc.? Yes, we're steeped in it, but we can still recognize that there's an issue and find a way. For me, I hope it's in a discussion, which is why then in getting accepted to have a talk here, because I don't speak that often in front of people, so there's a real kind of nervousness about it. I set up a little Psy-Art Cafe, I'm calling it. And I want to do some online discussions in groups. If anyone, hopefully that works, because I'm a total. Technically, I really just had to put this is very DIY. And really, what I'm wanting to do is just have conversations to begin with online. But really, I'd love that whole thing of having these conversations. For me, if I could do this every day, like the kind of going around chatting about these specific subjects, psychedelics, and how we live in society and how we experience the unknown. Those are the discussions that really should be predominating for me. I mean, let the science do its thing. To be really honest, I'm fascinated to a degree, but I'm really much more interested in how we communicate as human beings and how we get ourselves out of the pickle that we've got ourselves into. So thank you for listening.